Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey Freezing Iceman Knockreiner. Like nothing will have prepared you for Freezing Iceman. I'm in Minnesota right now, and even though it's getting fall-like in Seattle, and I'm sure it's still spring-like in Austin, Minnesota is full-on winter feeling. It is cold.
Oh yeah, Minnesota.
Oh yeah, Minnesota. Fargo.
I head off to New York tomorrow, and it's supposed to snow there as well.
That sounds more fun.
I will be joining you in the freezing cold locations, though. But anyways,
We're
not a
both
weather
talking
podcast.
AI.
On today's podcast, we'll cover the very first UEFI Bootkit for Linux. After that, we'll give an update on Chinese hackers targeting US telecommunications providers. And then we will end with a new way for phishing threat actors to evade email phishing protections with Word documents. With that,
UEFI. When you pronounce that UEFI, it sounds like a Final Fantasy character. I feel like there's a character whose name was close to UEFI. Anyways, sorry.
Entirely possible. With
This
that,
is not a gaming podcast, as Mark will remind me too.
Not a gaming podcast. Let's bootload our way in. So let's start today with the first story, which I read this when it was first released, and there has actually since been an update that we'll get to in a second. But this was a blog post last week from ESET's research team on their analysis of the very first UEFI. Corey, how do you pronounce it? Because I pronounce it literally
I
everything
do
wrong.
all the letters like you do, UEFI instead of UEFI.
UEFI. It's the very first UEFI bootkit that was designed for Linux systems. Now, quick update before we talk about this. They actually updated their article and said after the fact, they confirmed this was a proof of concept form of bootkit from a security training program in Korea. They got like a confirmation from the students that created this, but it's still really interesting research in how this thing worked. So UEFI bootkits, they've been the target of research for like a decade now, but mostly in the form of proof of concepts. There is EFI guard, boot backdoor, UEFI-bootkit specifically, but those were all like research created bootkits to prove that it's possible. It wasn't until 2021 where there were the first real UEFI bootkits that were discovered in the wild. There was ESPector and then FinSpy. And then in 2023, there was a pretty famous one called Black Lotus, which also included the ability to bypass UEFI secure boot, even on up-to-date systems. So it's only been relatively recent that there's been in the wild bootkits targeting UEFI instead of the old BIOS that we're all used to. But all of these, even the research ones, historically only targeted Windows systems. And that was their way of getting into the UEFI bootloader in order to load this rootkit in it. So this new bootkit, which was called BootKitty by its creators, is
So
the very
cute.
first one.
I love when dangerous, horrible things are so cute.
It is a clearly AI generated image too, but it is a very well done one, I guess. But anyway, so this is the very first one to actually target a Linux system as both the initial way to gain access to the bootloader and also what it does after the fact once it has compromised the system. So the main goal for this bootkit is to disable the Linux kernel's signature verification feature, which will then let the attackers load basically arbitrary Linux libraries as they want as the Linux kernel boots. Normally, like secure boot and other protections prevent malware from loading untrusted or unsigned code during the boot process. This bootkit starts before the Linux kernel, so the Linux operating system actually boots, which allows it to tamper with and remove a lot of those protections. So the bootkit was uploaded to VirusTotal last month in November. It uses a self-signed certificate, which means it's not really capable of running on systems that have secure boot enabled, unless the victim is somehow tricked into installing the attacker's certificates, which is pretty unlikely. This and a few other factors led ESET to believe at the time, before it was confirmed, that this was like a proof of concept and not an actual malware payload that's out there in the wild. But And the other reason they thought it was a proof of concept is it uses hard-coded memory locations, hard-coded byte patterns to actually patch the bootloader and patch the Linux kernel, which means it only works on a couple of versions of Ubuntu and nothing else. And in fact, because it's hard-coded and it doesn't have any kernel version checking, if you run it on a unsupported system, it'll just patch a completely random location in memory and cause the system to crash instead of compromising it. Yeah, not ideal. But so when BootKitty executes, the first thing it does is it hooks and patches the UEFI firmware itself. So it looks in the memory of UEFI, looks to see if secure boot is enabled, and if so, it patches a file authentication function, which is basically how UEFI does integrity checking for its images that it loads. And it patches it to make it always return success. So what this means is no matter what comes next, it will always pass integrity validation within the UEFI firmware so that the boot can move on to the next step, which is usually the grub bootloader on Linux. So the next thing the malware does is it loads up the legitimate grub bootloader from a hard-coded path on the file system, and then patches several functions in the bootloader that were responsible for integrity checking and loading the Linux kernel image itself too. So it's already gotten past UEFI, it's in the bootloader now, it's patched that to get past integrity checking permissions, then it goes to load up the Linux kernel. And with its access to that bootloader, it's able to overwrite a bunch of stuff within the kernel as it's being loaded. Like it changes the version, it changes the Linux banner to say, I think it was like Bob 13, which is the name of the hacking team, best of the best, that made this bootloader. It also hooks into the signature check function in there to make it always return good, which basically means any untrusted code can run now within Linux. And then finally, it updates the very first environment variable for the init process in Linux, like the very first function that executes. That environment variable, it's called LD preload. It's basically a list of libraries that will load before any other function executes on the system. And it updates that to point to two shared objects, so two other libraries that the researchers weren't able to get their hands on, but basically at this point, it could be any malware that you want to load on the system. So that was a lot and a little technical, but basically it goes after the UEFI like BIOS firmware, uses that to patch the bootloader, uses that to patch the Linux kernel, and uses that to load malware at the time where the kernel first boots up. And bootloaders aren't new. Like we've had rootkits like this targeting Windows systems. We even had rootkits targeting old BIOS-based Linux systems for a long time. But being the first one using UEFI makes it really interesting. And I guess, Corey, if we want to talk about it, the concerns about a rootkit like this that can inject malware before the operating system even loads, you want to talk about what the risks of that are and what levels of access
it's just rootkit. It's if you think about a typical kernel rootkit, that's like gaining the best privilege of the operating system. But this is even before the operating system. So even if you have, in this case, a Linux kernel processes telling you, here are the files that I see, the bootkit can now affect the results of that and maybe subtract files that are really there, or network connections, or it's just at a higher level than the operating system itself. So, you want to be able to lie if you're a malware author at the highest level. That's why kernel level rootkits are the best OS ones, but a bootkit level rootkit, you can lie to everything on the system pretty much. That's my simple take, unless you have a more technical one, Mark.
No, that's absolutely right. The concern is, even your anti-malware on Linux, it runs with kernel level permissions, so really high level permissions, but this is one step above it where even before the anti-malware is even to load on the system during boot, you could patch it out of it if you wanted to with this level of access. And the other thing I wanted to talk about on this is, so this was a research project. It was confirmed that some students in Korea are the ones that did it as a proof of concept. It's still a little rough around the edges with some of its, manual byte offsets to go patch memory locations, self-signed certificate, but it is like a successful proof of concept. This is something that
For
could
sure.
work. And we've seen in previous examples, like research projects or uh, like for fun malware or attacks that ends up being weaponized in the future. And so I'm curious on your hot take on that, Corey.
Well, even
Like, what is the
good
risk
guy
of this?
tools, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Metasploit is something HD Moore started for a good guy, granted red teaming stuff, but for good guys. Same with Nmap, So like any good security tool, and this isn't a security tool. This is a proof of concept. I mean, on one hand, I'm pro this because sometimes to prove a problem is really a problem to the vendors that are managing UEFI and dealing with trying to make a OS boot using secure boot processes all the way from the beginning. They need to understand these vulnerabilities. So I think it's a good proof of concept. But unlike like a Metasploit, which you could come up with a good guy use for, this proof of concept is just proving a malicious. I can't imagine a case you would use this for good. So I think it should exist as a research project, and it's a good opportunity to show people weaknesses in UEFI and trusted boot sequences. But it's probably even worse than like a good guy tool being leveraged for malware, because it's if now that the research can leak out, I'm sure someone might make the malicious version. What
Yep.
do you think?
I agree. And the concern is, I think this is far enough along that really all an attacker would need to do is add some better version checking and maybe support more operating systems, and then compromise someone that has a driver signing key, like a high privileged certificate that they can
Yeah,
use
that
to
is the
cryptographically
good
sign
news,
in.
right? The fact that it's self-signed as a research project, you would have to be tricked into loading this. But I'm not sure that's as hard as you might think, Mark. I mean, only in that social. I mean, maybe I'm a nerdy gamer and I use MSI tools, or more often than more people to update their computer BIOS. I could see some malware actually hooking into, you probably have some sort of, on a gaming machine, software that helps you update your motherboard's BIOS all the time. And if I were a smart attacker trying to trick a process, I would try to hook into that legitimate uploader process and then come up with some sort of pop-up that gives you a reason to accept this self-signed cert. So I there could be some ways like to social engineer someone that's updating motherboard BIOS is a lot to maybe think this self-signed one was worth installing, but it would take some social engineering for sure. But you're right.
Does
I mean, we've seen stolen digital certificates from legit companies all the time, and if you give this a legit certificate, it's more of a game over.
And it looks like, just reading through Ubuntu's docs really quick, all you really need is just a privileged user on the system, so like pseudo level permissions in
You
order
do
to
need
install
sudo
a
though. Okay.
certificate. Yeah.
Yeah.
But even with just that, you can install a certificate for secure boot that would then allow this to potentially run. So this would be, I guess, a way for someone that already has administrative access to the system to elevate that to rootkit access on the system,
Yeah.
potentially. So it sounds like the researchers plan to present it at a conference sometime in the
Cool.
future. They said that a few samples leaked out prior to our planned conference presentation, unfortunately. I will be eagerly awaiting to hear.
How? Yeah.
Well,
That's
they uploaded
interesting.
it to VirusTotal, so someone screwed
That
up their
must
OPSEC.
be. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
But either way, it is cool research, and hopefully this doesn't open a wave of new rootkits targeting Linux systems. But hats off to the best of the best out of Korea on creating new malware. Hooray.
Yeah. And good luck, South Korea, with the weird stuff happening there as we record the podcast. Apparently, the president or whatever put them under military rule for a couple hours before their Congress reversed it.
Totally normal. That sounds great. Man, we are spiraling towards a crazy
Yeah.
couple of years, I think, in this
On a
world. But
positive side, the U.S. isn't the only government that has mixed opinions.
yes, that's positive. Anyways, not a political podcast. Moving on. The second story I wanted to talk about was an update to something we chatted about at the end of October. which, if you remember, news had just broken at the time that Chinese-backed, state-sponsored backed threat actors had compromised several U.S. telecommunications providers and potentially accessed the wiretapping systems at these telcos. Well, last week, the day before Thanksgiving, T-Mobile's chief security officer published a blog post titled "An Update on Recent Cyber Attacks Targeting U.S. Wireless Companies." And in their blog post, it's a continuation of that story. They describe their own run-in with these threat actors, where they detected attempts to compromise their network from a wireline provider's network that is connected there. So wireline, like a backbone provider. I think my brain just failed me on the names of the big ones in the US. Verizon is one of them, and there's several others too, that basically connect these telcos together with the big backhaul wires. So they said they succeeded in compromising several T-Mobile routers before they were detected and kicked off of the network. And they did not succeed in making further inroads into T-Mobile. They said they quickly severed the connectivity to their provider's network because they believed it was and likely still is compromised. And they said they couldn't definitively attribute this to Salt Typhoon, the Chinese nation-state backed threat actors that were named by several other sources. But they did provide their findings to the U.S. government for investigation and for assistance. So this was another update on a story that has continued to evolve over the last month. It was a couple of weeks ago now, I think. The senator from Oregon, I think it's Oregon, Mark Warner, he's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, called this the worst telecom hack in our nation's history in the United States. That they could have had access to unencrypted SMS messages sent between like Android and Apple devices. They could have had access to all of the metadata and did have access to all of the metadata for phone calls between potential victims. The FBI actually confirmed now that just shy of 150 people had their text messages and phone calls monitored. The FBI has reached out to them to let them know. Most of them, surprise, surprise, were in the Washington, D.C. area. So this is clearly Chinese state-sponsored actors going after politicians and people in government influence in D.C. to monitor what they're doing. The New York Times also reported recently that they lacked the ability to listen to past phone calls, but they could have gathered metadata about previous phone calls too, like dating back all the way.
Makes sense. Doesn't that kind of correlate to Patriot Act, where they don't actually have the content of the calls, but they have metadata that can show when they happened, where they were pinging, that kind of crap?
Exactly. And I guess like what are the useful things someone could get out of that? Like I guess you could figure
I
out
mean,
who someone's
bounty
talking
hunters
to,
use it. Yeah, who they're
where they
talking to
are.
based on location, all the places that particular target. I mean, you could learn where they live, where they work, where they shop, where they go, where they are different hours of the day.
Mm-hmm.
I'm bounty hunter. I mean, ISPs are not supposed to sell this information to be used in this way, but apparently they can sell it in some forms to third parties who then sell it in some forms to bounty hunters. And apparently some stalkers have gotten access to this type of telephone metadata to track people. So
Not
nasty
ideal.
stuff. Yeah.
So the thing that stood out to me on this T-Mobile as they were describing it, they said they detected like anomalous activity on their network equipment that looked like recon activity coming from their network equipment itself. So it sounds like that actors got a hold of, let's say, like a Cisco router that they had. From there, they were probably doing like port scans or network scans to figure out other targets, and that's where T-Mobile was able to catch them.
Yep.
And
Yeah, great opportunity to buzz market NDR, our WatchGuard's network detection and response solution, which is all about not just paying attention to outside traffic coming in north-south, but starting to pay attention to activity inside your network, understanding the norms over time, like training for 7 days so that you understand what anomalous network activity would be when it happens. So sounds like T-Mobile at least has something that's paying attention to network activity on that level.
I think that's a good point. Like it's your Cisco router probably doesn't port scan your whole network on a regular basis. And so if you're
That would
using
be
anomaly
unusual.
detection, that would be a pretty easy and quick way to catch that type of threat.
And you also pointed out, I mean, a big takeaway is I don't think they shared details other than T-Mobile routers. And I guess we can assume there's Cisco or something like that. But over and over, including our own Cyclops Blink, but VPN filter, the Fortinet, Sophos, and Palo Alto, these threat actors, nation state threat actors, are going after network gateways. Network gateways are obviously one of the most valuable things to get, whether you're going after a single company or you're going after a telco who has gateways all over the place. So it is interesting that these devices, it almost doesn't matter who makes them, they practically need to be bulletproof now because they seem to be the entry point for all kinds of sophisticated attacks. It's the actual
Yeah.
network equipment we use to connect ourselves to everything.
And in this case, it took it a step further where it doesn't sound like these were like exposed to the internet like we're seeing in all those other attacks.
Internal.
It was
Yeah.
exposed to a separate service provider that T-Mobile
Yeah.
partnered with and like peered a network with. And
A
because that
digital
service
supply
provider
chain.
got compromised, exactly. It's a lot like the Target hack where it was the
Yeah.
HVAC company that got nailed and was able to hit Target's
Yeah.
network then. This is their service
We often
provider.
talk about software. Like I would bucket everything into supply chain attacks in some form, but software supply chain attacks are like when a software vendor has a vulnerability. But I don't think you should discount digital supply chain, which could just be equipment or connections. The elevated privilege, like even giving an external service provider like HVAC privileged access to one of your internal web portals can cause issues, as Target learned. And in this case, an external network company that connects all the telcos became the digital supply chain vector. So, yep, supply chain, I think one of our predictions for next year is probably going to do well.
And then, like, last funny thing on this is the Reddit post that came along with this. Everyone in the
Didn't see it.
comments was like dunking on T-Mobile for, oh, look, T-Mobile got hacked again. But I've got a contrarian view on this where I think T-Mobile actually came out ahead in this one compared to everyone else. They caught this threat and killed it like on its first hop into the network. Yes, they had some systems compromised, but it was their like perimeter network equipment, and that was it. Compare that to the other telecommunications providers, AT&T, Lumen was another one where they got access to their wiretapping systems inside the company.
Yeah.
So
Ouch.
this is a win for T-Mobile as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
They detected anomalous activity like as quickly as it started, responded, killed it off, and they're good to go. So they deserve applause and not bashing for
I
all
agree.
of their other breaches they have had every single couple of months for the last 5 years.
And we've said both these things so many times, but I think it's proving to be true with the threat landscape right now. It's not a matter of if, but when. Like, I don't care how big you are, whether you have government level of security like the NSA did, and yet they got hacked, or whether you have peon level security. Like, you can't just, we are fighting a war, and there are going to be battles lost. So I don't think it's worth judging T-Mobile right away just because something like this happened, but it's more about their transparency in fixing it. And to your point, they actually found and detected and did something about it before many of the other companies did too. So,
Yep.
yeah, still a sucky breach to happen, but it sounds like they did better than most.
Exactly. So hats off to T-Mobile. At least this didn't end up like their numerous other data breaches they continue to have. So moving on to the last story. Now, this one was published on Sunday, and it was an analysis from AnyRun, which is like a cloud-free sandboxing service to look at malware behaviors in a secure location.
I've used it
Now,
before when I didn't have my VMs up and running and wanted to do something really quick. It's a
it's a
convenient
great tool.
service.
Like our
Yeah.
malware analysts use it on a regular basis as just another potential thing to look for behaviors of threats. And in this case, it was on the topic of a pretty novel way to evade email security and deliver malicious Word documents. So the attack starts with a normal phishing email, and this time including an email attachment that pretends to be something like pay benefits or bonus information for the target company. So something that would make people think, ooh, that's interesting. I want to see what everyone else makes at my company and trick them into opening it. But the trick, the novel technique they're using is the Word document is actually corrupted. It has issues in it where when you first open it in Microsoft Word, it says there's unreadable content in this file, it's corrupted, and then asks if you want to recover the file. So it's not a valid document. So presumably, if some other email security tool tried to open it, it may fail to open and analyze it. But it's corrupted in a way where if you hit yes and tell it to recover it, it's actually really easy to recover the underlying the Word document in there, which displays just a pretty basic QR code to quote unquote retrieve a document. Now, if you scan the QR code, it takes you to a fake Microsoft 365 login form that looks pretty realistic. I mean, if you're not paying attention to the domain at the top, has nothing to do with Microsoft. And the phish itself isn't notable. Like that happens all the time. Even QR code based phishing is on the rise these days. But using a corrupted Word document can make it pretty difficult for some phishing protection systems to analyze that file and catch the malicious content before it makes it into a victim's machine. Now, the caveat to this, like Corey, we've talked about this before, where as soon as you start requiring user interaction as a part of your phish, it lowers the chance of it succeeding. But I feel like this is the type of user interaction where maybe that doesn't lower the barrier a whole lot.
People might be somewhat used to this, although we do tell you all the time that you should not, if Word or Excel ask you to do anything with the unsolicited document, say no. By the way, was the corruption? I know that there's a particular base64 string that's it's even in the file name for some of the ones in the wild. But even when you get the unreadable content, the first part of the unreadable content is it basically just base64 decode, base64 encoding that when you say yes, it decodes.
I don't actually know exactly how they corrupted it. They didn't go into that detail. It looks like what you're saying is correct.
I noticed there is that base64 string that's in every file name, but it's interesting that it's also in the message right at the beginning of this is unreadable too.
Yep.
What it decodes to is not that interesting. But the rest of it, I'm wondering if the rest is base64 too, and there's more to it. But anyways, no, I think it's a novel way to get people to interact with a Word document. Like you say, curiosity of if HR accidentally sent you something about people's pay, saying it's corrupted and fixing it is something I could see people accidentally doing even though they shouldn't. And then obfuscating the rest with a QR code is good.
I'm hoping
Although remember, always check your domains, people.
I'm hoping that this is still one where just good phishing awareness training would still help people realize, oh, crap, maybe I shouldn't scan that QR code. Because once you do get the uncorrupted document, once it repairs itself, it's pretty obvious, in at least my opinion, as a security practitioner, it's a phish. And so hopefully after enough training, it's obvious to other people too. But it's clear that attackers are looking for ways to every single opportunity they can to get things to slip past security tools in one way or another. Like I've seen like QR code phishing where instead of a picture of a QR code, they like build it using ASCII text, use it text to build it out in a message to get past some of those like optical character recognition tools. Like they're getting pretty clever these days.
Yeah.
And I think it highlights the need for, or the continued need for user training in this case, because attackers will always find a way past a technical control, always.
Yep.
And so users are the last line of
Even
defense.
if we somehow had secure design and secure coding perfected and there's never vulnerabilities, social engineering would still be the way people hacked. Getting people to do things they shouldn't, even if the software tries to do the right thing.
Yep, agreed. So either way, interesting research, even if the phish itself isn't new. That was still, I wonder what they'll come up with next when it comes to tricking us into opening malicious Word documents.
Hey, more evidence for one of our predictions for this year, QR codes.
Heck yeah. Speaking of which,
I guess it still hasn't caused a headline hack, but still.
Yeah.
His predictions, the actual ones.
I think when we'll be able to talk about them. So stay tuned for that one. And again, if you have any predictions that you want us to chat about on that episode, you can probably find our email and shoot it that way. I'm on, what the heck's it called? Blue Sky.
Blue Sky.
It's mark.me. You can be one of my still single-digit followers if you want. And
I haven't even looked. I have an account, which is SecAdept, but I have not looked at it since making the account. Maybe we should use it more now that we're pointing people to it. It's hard
All
to
the
get
security
off
researchers are starting to show up there. So it's definitely the
Yeah.
new home for cybersecurity.
We will start playing around more.
But yeah, shoot us your predictions and we'll chat about it on the next episode. And man, I'm going to go eat some more leftover Thanksgiving because that was delicious.
I'm done with that, Mark. I had so many Thanksgiving dinners during the holidays for every family. I had so much leftovers. You could not make me eat any more of my sweet potatoes. I had way too much.
I will never be done. I love Thanksgiving food forever and always.
It's good food. It's definitely good food.
Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics, suggestions for future episode topics, or if you want to share your security predictions with us for the coming year, you can reach out to us on Instagram at watchguard_technologies or Blue Sky at itsmark.me or at secadept.bluesky.social, I'm assuming. Yeah, that sounds right. Whatever it is, at least it's not Twitter. Thanks again for listening. You will hear from us again next week.